Hello, badass sewists. In this video, I'm going to show you how to lay out and cut a pattern, with tips and hints to make sure you get it right. Welcome to Seemingly Badass, the channel dedicated to the making of clothes, costumes, and cosplay for all levels of badassery. It's sewing with an edge. In this video, I'm going to be cutting the same shirt out of two different fabrics. It's the first time I'm making this pattern, so this is my test garment for fit and construction. So the first fabric that I'm going to be using here is actually a flesh tone spandex color, or spandex fabric. And the second fabric that I'll be cutting it out of is actually a lace. And it's probably not very obvious, but it is a little bit sheer. And so that's why I wanted to put the flesh tone back on it. So I'll cut the flesh tone first, and then I'm going to cut the lace second. And I'm going to just walk you through the process. So the pattern that I'm using is a Jalie pattern. I think that's how you pronounce it. They're one of my favorite brands. You can buy them online. You can download the PDF and cut it out, and you can see how I do that in another video. But this one has 27 sizes, and so it has both my size and the person I'm giving the gift to, plus it actually has children's sizes. So it's the Jalie. So Jalie shows you, well, actually most patterns show you how to actually lay out the fabric on the, or lay out the pattern pieces on the fabric. And they give a suggested layout. Pretty much all patterns do that. And so this one actually shows both the front and the back cut on the fold, and then the sleeve is cut as a whole sleeve in the middle of the fabric. And so obviously you need to cut two sleeves. And so the pattern itself, which you can't see yet, is a half a sleeve cut on the fold. And so what they're showing in this particular layout is that you should trace or somehow fold the sleeve and cut two flat sleeves rather than one or two sleeves on a fold. The first thing I need to do is take my half a sleeve pattern and make a full sleeve pattern out of it. And so basically to do that, what I ended up doing was just grabbing a piece of scrap paper that I made sure that the sleeve would fit onto. And then I drew the vertical line that is the original fold line. And then I'm going to draw just a perpendicular hemline to that, because the hem of the sleeve actually is perpendicular. Now, if your hem of whatever pattern piece you're doing isn't perpendicular, then this won't work. But in this case it does, and so I get two lines. I get the perpendicular hemline, and then I have the fold line. And the fold line itself will become the grain line on the piece. And so normally you would assume, and you should, that the fold is the grain. And unless your pattern calls for you to fold it on bias, you will be folding your fabric on grain. So I did a little tape down there, and then I'm just going to trace it. There's some straight edges to use, so that makes things a little bit easier. And then the rest I just trace over the sleeve cap. I do pretty decent freehand, so I'm not terribly worried about like getting it absolutely perfect. So the more practice you get, the better that becomes. So once the first half is all traced out, then you can flip it over and line everything back up. So you line your fold line with your new drawn grain line. You line your bottom hem line or whatever up with your bottom of your pattern, and then make sure the tops line up. And you're ready to go. Retrace everything, both the sides all the way through the curve. So once I have the pattern completely traced, I'm going to then cut it out. And I like to cut my patterns pretty much on the cut line, except for if it's on a fold. And then if it's on a fold, I generally like to leave the fold line, have a little bit of paper hanging off of it. And that's just because when I lay it out on the fold, I prefer to put little weights, and you'll kind of see it. And there's actually one pattern piece in this that I made that doesn't have the little hanging out thing off the fold line. That kind of annoys me. I cut it out, and I cut it as close to the line, the cut line as I can, so that when I cut it with a rotary cutter, I'm not smashing the paper trying to cut it, because that actually makes it shift a little bit more. And so the closer I have, I don't trim the paper when I'm doing it. And you can cut with scissors. You can cut your fabric out with scissors. I choose not to most of the time, just because it is so much easier to do that with a rotary cutter. And so, so anyway, cut the piece. You can see in the video I have both. So once you know you have all of your pieces, then you can actually start laying out your fabric. And basically, I folded this one. I folded it in half exactly, and I'm trying to show you the selvage edge of the fabric. And so generally what you want to do is you want to fold your fabric so that you're folding selvage edge to selvage edge. Now, the layout that this suggested is actually slightly different, and so it's a fold from one side in and then a fold from the other side in a little bit further so that you can get the sleeve on it, which is actually the way I ended up folding this. But I wanted to test it to see if the pattern pieces would fit like lengthwise and if that would give me any benefit. And so I did that test, and that clearly didn't want to work the right way. I mean, there's so much fabric left, and so I can save so much fabric by cutting this in the way that they suggested, which is folding one end in, and this fabric's really slippery and I have a lot of it, and so it keeps sliding off my table. And so there's a couple tricks I sometimes use. One is to stick a heavy weight or scissors on it, and sometimes it'll actually stick to my cutting mat, but in this one it actually still wanted to slip off, so you'll see that. I do own 2 cutting mats. They are a bit of an investment, and so one thing to note though is they're usually about, well, these are 2x3 and you can get smaller ones, but these are about 2x3, and the pattern piece itself is longer than the shortest width of the cutting mat. And so I like to use 2 of them, and I butt them up against each other, which only has a little bit of a area where then sometimes it doesn't cut. But the reason why I like to use 2 is because then I can go the full width of my table, which is usually the full width of the fabric, which you'll see here. I actually can lay out both one side and the other side of it. But that is an investment, and so I don't necessarily recommend doing that to get started. It'll just mean you have to do a lot more futzing with your fabric when you're cutting it out. But to get started, you can just get one cutting mat. In fact, you could actually just not even use cutting mats and just use just use scissors and pins. So sometimes it does take a little bit of futzing to figure out like exactly how you want to lay out your pattern. And so once I learned that the fabric is wide enough to do what I want to do, rather than having to do the sleeve up top or bottom, then I'm able to actually start the layout process. And so one of the things that you need to make sure is that your fold is actually straight on grain. The easiest way to do that is to measure from the fold line to the selvage edge. And so in this case, the selvage edge has a little bit of a wrinkle in it. And so I went to there's like a line on the selvage edge that is pretty consistent. And so I measured from the fold to that line. And I'm just using a basic, cloth, or I guess they're vinyl now or whatever, tape measure. I'm measuring in 2 spots, first of all. And then also I want to measure the width of the pattern just to make sure that I'm going to fold it far enough. And so I think, if I remember right, this is, a little over 9 inches, so just under 10. And so I can make sure that when I fold the fabric, I'm folding it far enough in to accommodate the entire pattern and pattern size. So another thing that you'll need to do probably is measure it multiple times. And so you measure the top, you measure the bottom, you measure the top, you measure the bottom, you keep going back and forth and making these little adjustments here and there. So once I have the pattern pretty much the way I want it to be, I'll start placing it on there with weights. And I like to maximize my fabric usage, so I get it as close to the edge of the fabric as I possibly can. The other thing I noted somewhere along here is that I I wanted to make sure I knew the inside and the outside of the fabric, or the right side and the wrong side. And so not that it matters that much on this pattern. There's no markings that I have to make that are like within the pattern that need like tracing, where you would want to trace it on the wrong side of the fabric. The only markings on this one that I need to transfer really are notches. And so there's a shoulder notch and a side seam notch. And so I lay out as many weights as I feel necessary. I like to get them in the curves, and then I just go and cut with my handy dandy rotary cutter. There's a little nut on one side of the rotary cutter, and it sometimes can hit the weights. And if the weights are it depends on the fabric, but sometimes moving the weights will move the pattern piece, which will mess everything up. And so that's kind of a pain in the dippa. So I like to keep the non-nut side closest to the pattern piece. And then I do that as best as I can. And sometimes I can't. And then I cut everything out. So you'll kind of see me stand in the way here, cutting everything out. Once it's cut, which sometimes it doesn't get quite all the way through, and then there's always that little chunk that I have where the two boards or the two cutting mats meet up. I gently pull it away, and especially on like a satin or something, I like to gently pull the fabric away and make sure that I've gotten everything cut. If you rip it away, you could actually end up like snagging your fabric. And then I just take a pair of scissors. These scissors actually cut all the way to the tip, and so I use those to cut my notches, and I'm just taking a little 1/8 inch snip on both layers of the fabric on each of the two notches. And then I just keep the pattern piece with the fabric, set it aside so I can lay out the next set of pieces, but I keep that just so I can make sure that I don't cut two of the same, or four of the same pieces, or, whatever. And then forget to cut something else. And so in this case, I have a back unfold, a front unfold, and then I have to cut two sleeves and a neckline, or a neckband. And the neckband's really small, and that one's going to happen here pretty soon. But basically, what I'm doing here is making sure that I know how wide I have to fold the fabric to get both the back and the sleeve into it. And yes, my fabric's a little bit wrinkled. Because this is a close fit knit and a test pattern or a test garment, I wasn't too concerned about it, because I'm really just going for fit and form of the finished product here. You would want to iron your fabric before you cut it if it is as wrinkly as some of this is. But make sure that if you do decide to iron your fabric before you cut it, that you test it, because some fabrics don't iron well, like vinyl. You can't iron vinyl, and velvet. Some velvets you can't really iron very well either. So test it first, iron it out, make sure you don't have the wrinkles in it. So once I get everything lined up and ready to go, I need to make sure that I can fit all the pieces again. And then I also needed to fit in that the neckband somewhere. So once that's done, I can start laying it out. And in this case, I did the neckband first, and then apparently had some music on. I did the neckband first, and then I did the back piece. In the next step, I actually have to line up the sleeve. And so if I did the sleeve first, I would have done it and measured it against the selvage or the fold line rather than the selvage line. And actually I prefer to do that. And so it's a note to self. Next time I lay out this pattern on this fabric, if I can do it this way, I will actually cut, or I'll lay out and cut the sleeve first, and maybe give it a little bit more space so I know it'll actually make it through there. So cutting these little tiny neckline, it's like maybe an inch and a half to 2 inch wide strip of fabric can be kind of challenging. The the fabric and the pattern piece like to slip, and then the weights are slightly bigger than the piece, and so sometimes it takes a little extra futzing to get it good. Um, and then this one also has a couple notches on the end of it. Okay, since I cut the back piece first, I don't have the fold line because I'm going to move the pattern piece out of the way. So I don't have the fold line anymore to measure to. And so what I need to do is make sure that the sleeve is on grain. And so now I need to line it up with the selvage edge. And so in order to do that, you measure from the grain line to the selvage edge on both ends of the grain line, and it has to be the same. So, and I generally try to get it within about a 16th inch of or closer. So as if I can get it super close, sometimes the selvage edge isn't really that easy to measure to. But if you can get it really accurate, that's better. It's gonna matter just a little bit more, I think, on woven fabrics and on a knit, just because the knit has the stretch in all the directions and maybe not as subject to hanging weird. But the woven's definitely got to get it right. And so this always takes like a couple extra things. So you can, or a couple extra trials. You can try a couple things. Like I like to pile weights up on one end, but you could also take a pin and just take a real small like sliver of fabric at one end. So you basically anchor that one end of the fabric, or yeah, the pattern onto the fabric, and then as you move the other end, it'll pivot. And so you don't want to take more than maybe an eighth of an inch of fabric when you take that that little pin bit. But I generally don't use pins because I don't like to use pins. Also, you have to make sure if you are using pins that it doesn't mar the fabric itself. So some fabrics you can't pin without like putting a hole in it. So like vinyl, some satins. Be careful, test it. If you have to pin in the seam allowance. And so that might not work so good if you're trying to line up a grain line. And so just be wary of that, and maybe you still need to do some weights to line that up even if you're going to pin to cut. Once you do all the lining up, then you can cut it out. And of course, I'm using the handy dandy rotary cutter again. But something that you'll notice with sleeve patterns, since the sleeve angles in towards the end or the hemline of the sleeve, it'll angle out again for the hem allowance. And so in order to get that cut, I usually use scissors. If you use the rotary cutter, you basically will cut into the pattern itself, and that's not usually good. I mean, sometimes you can get away with it, but I highly recommend not doing it if you can avoid it. This is an awkward angle to get to, but cutting those little 5/8 inch or half inch or 3/4 inch bits for the allowance there. Yeah, and then it's all done. So the second fabric that I wanted to use is actually this lace fabric, and it's a bit strange. Well, it's not strange. It's it's striped, and the stripes are going the length of the grain, and so it's got this kind of fun sort of scalloped edge that's the selvage edge. And so there's a couple things that I really wanted to do with it. One, I wanted the stripes to go across the body, just because I thought it would look really weird to make them vertical. And then also I wanted to use the selvage edge as the hem, so I didn't have to hem it. And so basically I kind of wanted this sort of scallopy edges on both the sleeves and the body of the the fabric. So there's a couple things I have to make sure. One, because it's a knit close fit shirt, I want to make sure that the greatest degree of stretch is in the direction that I actually am going to lay the pattern out. So to test for the stretch amount, you basically want to take some normal number, like 4 or 5 inches, and I'm doing like a 4-inch pinch here. You pinch a couple inches, 4 or 5 inches, and then you stretch it as far as it feels like you can stretch it comfortably, that it's actually going to bounce back elastically. And so you can see kind of, I'm getting about 3 inches of stretch in one direction and only 2 inches of stretch in the other direction. And so the greatest degree of stretch is actually with the stripe, which is actually with the grain, which isn't always that uncommon when you're using a knit fabric. So just heads up, I want the straight of grain, or I want the greatest degree of stretch to go with the width of the pattern. There's a catch with laying out fabric this way, and it's this: if you are not folding your selvage edge in, you cannot measure the selvage edge to the fold to test for the appropriate amount of distance. In this case, I'm actually going to measure from the cut. Well, I'm not going to measure. If I were to measure, it'd be from the fold to the cut line, and the cut line you can never trust as straight or on grain or anything. And so what I'm actually doing when I'm folding this pattern up, or folding the fabric up, is aligning the stripes. And so I want to make sure that all my stripes are basically in line with each other. And if they are, then I know that the fabric is folded on grain. I want to line the stripes up from one side of the fabric, or one side of the shirt, to the other side. And so I'm basically taking my pencil and marking where the prominent stripe is. And so I can make sure that when I use the back side of the pattern, they line up. And so if I line my hemlines up, and I mark where those stripe points meet, then when I lay out my back pattern, I can put it on the same stripe, which is important. It's not as critical with this stripe because it's actually kind of a chevron stripe. It kind of reminds me of Charlie Brown's shirt. But you know, like, this is one of the ways you would line up real obvious stripes, you know, that are a little bit more bold and would actually not have as much forgivingness to it. Forgiveness, that's the word. Yeah. So anyway, so I just did a couple marks on this shirt, and then a couple marks on the other pattern, and then that way when I cut them, I know that they're going to line up at least relatively well. Because I need to cut the neckband on a fold and I want to line the stripe up, I can't do the stripe, you know, I can't do the neckband kind of in the same layout that I did the other one, but the fabric is so wide that I can kind of get the neckband to fit in between the edge, the cut edge, and the side seam of the back piece here. And so instead of tracing the pattern out to be flat without the fold, I just basically use the other pattern piece, or the other piece that I had cut, to test it to see if it would fit. And so once I kind of get it all figured out, then I'm going to really make sure that everything's lined up and smoothed out, and then I'll recut it. One trick for making sure that your fabric is all really lined up correctly, when you do like brush it, like you see me do a lot of like brushing, make sure you're brushing it light and you're not stretching it. You want to make sure that the bottom layer is actually not stretched, and you can see I fluff it to like to kind of detach the two layers from each other and move it. So I'll like fluff it and move it, and then like line it up, and then gently brush it. And then it's not as obvious on this one or on the other one. And the other fabric that I cut was actually quite nice to work with, other than it slipping off the table. But the if the if there's a wrinkle, and you can see a wrinkle in this one before I'm laying it out, but I'm not going to cut on that part, so it's kind of, it doesn't matter. But if you see wrinkles like that, and they're close to the fold edge of the fabric, then that basically means that you don't really have all of your fabric quite on grain. So if you fold your fabric and it has wrinkles at the fold line, it is not on grain. That kind of gives you a heads up, and then you can move it towards the wrinkle direction to make the wrinkle go away, and then you're more on grain. So that's just a hint. It's not as obvious in this video, but this particular fabric is quite thick, and it has actually a variation in thickness across the stripes, and so the lavender stripes are way thicker than the other black part of the stripes. I wasn't actually sure how well the notches that would be visible when I went to actually sew it. So, and they were, but boy, it was tough. So yeah, just so you know, sometimes that just doesn't work out that good. So since I don't need to cut two necklines, I pulled the top layer of the fabric off and then folded it so I could use my fold pattern. And the thing I had to make a decision on was to use the purple stripe or the black stripe. And so I actually chose the black stripe to cut this, partially because it would be less thick. There you have it. 2 shirts cut out in 27 minutes. Just kidding. I hope it was insightful into my process and some of the tips and tricks I use to cut my stuff out. I did sew the shirt, so I can't show the final piles of fabric pieces, so here's a picture of the shirt. Remember to give this video a like if you found it helpful, and leave a comment below if you have questions or want to see specific content. Hit that subscribe button for more sewing badassery, and remember to click the bell icon to get notifications when I post new content. And for more information and articles on me and my creative exploits, check out my blog. The link's in the description below.